Hello, and I want to welcome you to a discussion on factoring trinomials of the form x squared plus bx plus c. Alright, let's get started. If we look at this generic form x squared plus bx plus c, we see that the x squared has a coefficient of 1. The coefficient of the x variable is b, which will represent a number, and finally c is some other number. So let's talk about this factoring. Okay, so we're going to take this term and we're going to break it into two separate pieces, and we're going to use the reverse of the FOIL method. That way, if we were to use the FOIL method, we can get back to this form right here. So what's important to note is that these blanks right here in this first set of parentheses and the second term right there that is blank in the second parentheses will sum to equal b, or this b term right here. So let's consider we in the past have been working backwards, where we were given something like this and we were asked to find the trinomial that would resemble something like this. So we're actually working backwards, where we, in the examples, will be given something like this, and we have to give something similar to this for the answer. So just to refresh, let's consider the quantities x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 4. If we use the FOIL method, we will distribute the x times the x right here in the second. We will also distribute the x in the first set of parentheses to the 4. Continuing the FOIL method, we'll take the 2, distribute it to the 2 right there, or the x right there in the second set of parentheses, and then we'll also distribute it to the 4 in the second set of parentheses. So we just go ahead and FOIL this out, x times x, and then plus x times 4, that is the O. Now if we do the I, 2 times x, then finally 2 times the 4 to do the L, or last term. Okay, if we take this and simplify, we get x squared, we get 4x plus 2x plus 2 times 4 is 8. Simplify a little bit further, we get x squared plus 6x plus 8. Okay, and notice that, like we said up here and before, these two blanks sum to equal b. Well, in this case, we see the b is equal to 6, and just as we said, 2 and 4 add together and give you 6 for the sum of b. Alrighty, some important notes to think about whenever working these type of problems. First term always comes from multiplying the first term together. The last term comes from multiplying the last terms together. Alrighty, these are going to be some important notes, and also I'd like to have a note about signs. Okay, sign patterns when factoring. A positive constraint is a polynomial, or trinomial, tells us to look for two numbers with the same sign. The sign of the coefficient of the middle term tells us whether the signs are both positive or negative. First of all, if positive, then both signs are positive. If negative, both signs are negative. Okay. Secondly, a negative constraint in a trinomial tells us to look for two numbers with opposite signs. The sign of the coefficient of the middle term tells us the sign of the larger of the two numbers. First of all, if positive, then the larger number is also positive. If negative, then the larger number is negative. Okay, those are just some generic terms to keep in mind, and they will make more sense once we get into some examples, which we are going to do now. Looking at some examples of factoring the trinomial completely. Okay, so what we have to do is look for things that multiply to give us c that add to give us b, because we're using the generic term of x squared plus b plus c. So the number that has no variable attached to it will be c. One that has the plain x will just be b. So negative 7 is b in this case, and 12 is c. So think of the things that multiply together to give you 12 that add to give you a negative 7. Well, let's just write these out. 1 and 12 give you 12. 2 and 6 give you 12. And if you think 3 and 4 give you 12. These are multiplying them out. If we were to multiply these numbers together, each set would give us 12. So now we're ready to break into our parentheses. And since we have the simple x squared, just write x in each case. Right, and using the rules about signs from earlier, looking at the sign of c is positive. So that tells us to make both sets of parentheses the same sign that b has. And b is negative. See the negative 7? The negative tells us that both of these will be negative, because the positive sign of c tells us to write the same sign for b for each set of parentheses. And we'll see differently in some other examples what's going to happen when other things happen with signs. So now, since we see these things will multiply to give us 12, we have to say which of these will add together to give us 7. Or if we think in the case of both of these being negative, which of these combined will give us a negative 7. So if we use the process of elimination, negative 1 minus 12 would give us a minus 13. That is not negative 7, so we can't use that. Minus 2 minus 6 gives us a negative 8. We can't use that. It's close, but not close enough. And a negative 3 minus 4 gives us a negative 7. So these are our winners. And that is how you would break down how to factor that trinomial. Let's use the same process to work with number 2. So looking at things again that multiply to give us 12. So a 1, a 12, a 2, a 6, and then a 3 and 4. Okay, these are all multiplying. So let's break down our two sets of parentheses. Again, since we have just the x with the one coefficient, write x in each set of parentheses. Okay, and we look at the sign of c. Looking at the sign of c, we see that it is negative. It's a negative 12, so the sign is negative. When we have a negative, we know that we are going to have a negative and a positive sign in each set of parentheses. These are the rules that we just talked about with the sign patterns. When c is negative, place a negative and a positive in each part of the parenthesis, in each different parentheses, like we did below. Okay, now we know that we take the sign of b, which is negative, and we associate that with the higher value. So we go to our list, and as you know, this right side will contain the higher numbers, so we're going to associate those with the negatives. So now let's combine to see what would add or subtract together to give us a negative. And remember, there's a negative 1. So which of those we combine gives a negative 1? And I believe if you look, 3 minus 4 give us a negative 1. So let's throw the 4 here and the 3 with the positive. Because when we fill this back out, we're going to get something that looks like this. And we want the negative to go with a higher number to make sure we get the negative 1. Okay, let's look at number 3. We are working a lot with 12 in for C because it gives us very few possibilities to see what multiplies together. But I think we're going to swap in just a little bit and see what else we can use. So just thinking about what multiplies to give us 12 in for C. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. And remember, these multiply together to give us each 12. Okay, so just as before, we look for the sign of C. It is a positive. A positive tells us to open up the parentheses, and that In those parentheses, we're going to put in both sets for the signs the same sign in for b, which is a negative in this case. So there's going to be a negative here and a negative here. Just as before, we have the coefficient of 1 in for x, so please write an x right there to make sure when FOILed there is an x squared. Okay, now we have to say that both of these are negative because we have a negative right here and a negative right here. So each of these are going to be negative values. Now we have to think in terms of adding. If we were to add negative 1 and negative 12, or negative 2 and adding negative 6, or adding negative 3 and negative 4, which of those would combine to give you a negative 8? And if you look, the negative 2 and the negative 6 will work. So let's plug the 2 in there, since we have the negative there. Instead of the negative there, just place a 6 right there. And that is how you factor. And if you were to FOIL back out, you would see that you get that same trinomial. And finally, for this video, for part 1, we are going to factor this trinomial right here. X squared plus 2x minus 3. So let's get to it. First, let's start out by saying what multiplies to give you 3. A negative 3. So we have a 1 and a 3. And a 3 or a 1, either case you want to say. So, because 3 is prime and is only able to multiply 1 in itself to get the same product. So let's start off by opening up our parentheses. Again, since the coefficient of 1, let's place an x in each set of parentheses. The minus sign of c tells us that there's going to be a positive and a negative. So since we've got these cases, let's make each of these a negative, just to see how they would combine together. So we're looking for a positive. And remember, with our sign properties, the positive goes with the higher of the numbers. And if we look over here at our possible choices, 3 is the higher number, so it must be positive. So this set right here, we need to plug into our number, or our set of parentheses down here. Notice that 3 is positive, so please put that with the positive set, and the negative one, put that just a 1 in for the negative value. And just for remembering, if you were to FOIL these out, you would get this trinomial above.